Welcome to Uninformed Summary. This is a podcast where four friends discuss a person from history and their effect on history. This week we have me in the hot seat. Say hi. Hi. Followed by Matt. That's Matt. We also have Vinny is in the third spot. Say hi. And then in the last spot we have Molly as a guest host today. So say hi, Molly.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. This week we are discussing the first of a multi-part series of Alexander Hamilton. The bastard, son of a whore, other derogatory terms, as stated in the Broadway musical, or off-Broadway musical. So Alexander, this has been like in the making for so long, as all of the people that are on this podcast have heard me talk at least at length of about 4 hours each about Alexander Hamilton, Vinny probably being the one that's heard the most of it. So
Scott, I will admit that you are at least onto something when you say first of a multi-part. I heard 3-part. Multi means it could be more than 3.
It really depends on how this episode and the next episode go. So, but to start,
it's a lot.
Yes, it's a lot, and there's so much that I feel like Alexander Hamilton contributed to the history of the United States that I feel like I would do a disservice if I skipped, what he was doing when he was 10. I gotta cover it. So to start out with, Alexander Hamilton was born on January 11th, I'm going to do that a lot, 1755 or 1757, and we'll go into why that is later, on the island of Nevis in the British West Indies. It's an island off of Cuba. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, was married to Johann Michael Lavian, with whom she had a son named Peter, which is Hamilton's half-brother. And then in 1750, Rachel refused to live with Lavian any longer, which apparently under Danish law was punishable by prison. So they changed that around a little bit in the last few years, I think. But it was also stated that the reason she was imprisoned was because she had been unfaithful. Now, obviously, it's really hard to prove that. Photographs didn't exist, but that's a side reason, we'll say. And so she was in prison, I think it was like 10 months. And then she got out, and to the surprise of her husband, she decided to leave. Instead of staying with him, and she absconded with a Mr. James Hamilton. Now, I mentioned that she had a son named Peter. Well, he's gone. She doesn't believe in him anymore. He's off with the dad. So she just straight abandoned that son. And I believe he may have been a dick or something. I'm not entirely sure. But she left with James Hamilton and started a new life. And James Hamilton also happened to be the 4th heir to a Scottish laird. You don't see a whole lot of heirs to Scottish lairds in the West Indies, but that's what happened. So she, however, was unable to marry James Hamilton because of the fact that she was already married. So instead, they just continued a life unmarried, where she went on to have another child with James Hamilton, which was his older brother. I believe his name was Peter. Yes. She was a real sinner, just so you know. And then...
Okay, sorry to interrupt you. Wouldn't that make things harder for people back then to be born if you were born out of marriage in this time?
In general, but I also think it was a lot easier to just be like, no, we're married, bro. Yeah, I had the paper, but lost it. So...
That's a good point.
So she ended up having a son named I'm trying to see here now once again, because now I'm getting my own self confused. Peter was her first son, but she ended up having another son before she had Hamilton. But now part of them being unmarried did cause the problem of that if she was to die, well, he wouldn't inherit anything that she owned.
That's what I mean, right? Established ownership.
Right. Theoretically, he could, as long as there's no claims to that estate, essentially. Now, after Hamilton was born, I mean, there's not a whole lot he did between ages 1 to 9. He was a real slacker in those years. But when he was 10, his father left. So he got kind of the same treatment that his older brother did, Peter did. And so now his dad's not there. So his mother is now a single mother with 2 basically semi-ex-husbands, got 2 baby dads. And she moved basically to another part of the island and she opened up a general store. And then Hamilton and his older brother that was from the same dad, and his mom all stayed, they basically lived in the attic, or just above the general store. And while they were there is when Hamilton started to learn French. His mother actually has a French background, as you know, where she grew up. And so he grew up learning both English and French. And then now that he's got no dad to teach, help him out with anything, his mom comes down with a terrible case of yellow fever in 1768, which would have made Hamilton either 13 or 11. That's not at all confusing. And from what I read in the biography, it was really fucking gross. Because back then they had to, you couldn't just like walk around with yellow fever like you can now, in general. You would go sit in a bed all like Willy Wonka style, as everyone would just stay there. And they didn't have bedpans and all that. It was naturally really disgusting. And so what ends up happening is during that time, she dies. And now Hamilton has no father and no mother. But luckily, he's got the house, the general store he'll be able to inherit. Except that older brother Peter shows up out of nowhere. And her ex-husband, Johann Lavian, to be like, hey, so she's dead. I can't help but notice that I have her son here. And I think he deserves it. And the courts basically agreed with that. So already in Hamilton's life, his dad runs away, his mom's dead, now he's an orphan. So he has to go move in with his cousin, Peter Lytton. But now he's with, family once again, everything's fine. So then Peter Lytton kills himself.
Okay, cool, yeah.
Yeah. And so now once again he had nowhere else to go. His
Peter
brother,
is his cousin.
What's that?
You said, right? You said Peter Lytton is
Yeah.
Alexander Hamilton's cousin. So he has been absent
Most of the story,
basically 2 dads by this point.
Yeah.
Now his mom, and then his cousin kills himself.
Yeah.
All right, Scott.
He's got some familial issues.
You have my attention.
So now him and his brother are now homeless, and they've got to find a place to live. His brother ends up becoming a carpenter's apprentice, and like has a place to go and work on his stuff. Hamilton, however, was taken in and got to reside with her mother's landlord, whose name was Thomas Stevens. Now, something really weird in this story that happens much later is Thomas Stevens had a son as well that was right around the exact same age as Hamilton. And people that would see them together assumed that they were twins because they looked that much alike. They had all of the same things that they were interested in. They shared the same, penchant for the writing and all of those things, that some historians believe that James Hamilton is not Hamilton's father, but instead her landlord, because it would also make sense in the sense of like, why didn't he take in the older brother? He only took in Hamilton. So, but that's where we're at. So Thomas Stevens, the landlord, he worked for a company, and I can't for the life of me remember the name, but essentially it was like a trading charter that they had on the island. Is where he was at. And there would be times where, and generally speaking, I think there was like a period of like 6 to 7 months that he left, and he had been training Hamilton in everything that he could train him in. And so now Hamilton is running a trading charter at 14 years old. While he's running the trading charter, they were having slaves coming in and out of the island, meaning that Hamilton was actually actively making an inventory of slaves coming on, doing all of the trading where that's concerned. And I mean, it's pretty terrible, but
yeah, it's depressing.
Yeah. Now Hamilton, though, and this is later in life, he's an ardent abolitionist. It's a big thing of his story, is believed that maybe because he had to deal with these slaves and trading them and those kinds of things, that might be why he is such an ardent abolitionist, having seen it that firsthand.
I think that makes a lot of sense, right? If you saw that much awfulness, you would find many ways to hate it. Like seeing sausage made probably makes a lot of vegetarians out of people.
Yeah. Yep. Coincidentally, How the Sausage Gets Made is featured in the song Room Where It Happens in the off-Broadway musical Hamilton. Anyway, so the next thing, so Hamilton really got into writing around this time, and he was writing poems, and he was, I think the first recorded thing that he had published was these 2 poems that he wrote on the same page. I'm going to read them to you. At the age of his
first publication,
at the age of 14, this was his first publication, and the 2 poems basically go over what would follow Hamilton around as the types of women that he was interested in. All right, so I'll go through the first poem.
At 14.
Yeah, at 14. But there is some parallels to later in life. The women that he would chase after tended to fit in one of 2 categories. And so, yeah, so the first poem that he got submitted was, it starts out, "Silent she stood and sighed consent. To every tender kiss I gave, I closely urged to church we went, and Hymen joined our hands. Ye swains, behold my bliss complete, no longer then your own delay. Believe me, love is doubly sweet in wedlock's holy bands." It's a very sweet poem about young love, you know. Now the next poem starts out a little different. "Celia's an artful little slut. Be fond, she'll kiss, etc. But she must have all her will, for do not rub her against the grain. Behold a storm, blow winds and rain, go bid the waves be still." So, and like I said, you'll see this dichotomy of the very sexualized woman and more of the more pious, innocent woman. These will be a continuing themes as these episodes go on for Hamilton. So now he's working for the trading charter. I mean, everything's great now. You know, he's got his new adoptive dad, essentially. His mom's dead, but like, did I mention he's got an adoptive dad? So that makes up for everything, and everything's good now. And so it can only go up. And then on August 30th, 1772, a hurricane destroyed a considerable part of the island that Hamilton was residing on. As a result, he wrote a letter to his father about the hurricane that was later published in the local paper. And there's so much going on with whether or not the paper published this like under a guise, or if they actually happened to find it. But as the story goes, the letter was supposed to be delivered to his father. It didn't make it to his father. Someone found it, read the letter, thought it was really good, took it to a local paper. They found out it was, belonged to Hamilton, and asked Hamilton if they could publish it. He said no. And then they were like, "But pretty please." And he was like, "Okay." And so the poem is basically just talking about, or not the poem, but the letter that he wrote to his dad is basically talking about like how quickly you go from being boastful to being humble in this hurricane. I'll read part of it here where he says, "Where now, O vile worm, is all thy boasted fortitude and resolution? What has become of thine arrogance and self-sufficiency? Why dost thou tremble and stand aghast? How humble, how helpless, how contemptible you now appear. and for why. The jarring elements in the discord of clouds. Oh, impetus. Oh, presumptuous fool. And it goes on. It's a long poem. I could honestly make a whole podcast out of, yeah.
Old-timey writing.
Yeah. Oh, if you read the original, everywhere there's an S, there's an F, and that just doesn't make sense to me, you know. But
it's Philly. It is. It's
right.
Massachusetts.
But as a result of the letter, a lot of people were like, damn, dude, this guy is way smarter than is necessary to be on this island. We should send him to the colonies and see if we can get him an education where he'll prosper, as opposed to being kind of stuck here. And that's what they did. They brought up a collection and they sent him to the United States to get an education, and off he went. Now, when he got to America, which is a vast change, obviously, but that's been the consistency in his life up until this point. He gets to America and he ends up taking up lodgings with a guy named Hercules Mulligan, who was a tailor's apprentice. And the reason he took lodgings with him was because Hercules was friends with one of the traders that was on the island from Nevis. But they end up becoming really quick friends, and Mulligan eventually would help in the war for American independence, because he would eavesdrop on the British soldiers that he was being a tailor for, and then he would turn around and give that information to Washington.
And he had all the size, like sort of sizing chart data for those redcoats. You'd be like, if you want.
He knew what they looked like without their uniforms on.
Yeah. And you like, give confidence to the soldiers. Yeah, they're not that big, guys. They're not that big. We can take him.
He's got a 44-inch waist. You can aim a little to the right if you want. Now, we talked earlier about whether or not Hamilton was born in 55 or 57, and I'm going to say a few things on this podcast where I'm going to say what I think is the truth, despite what historians think. I didn't go to college to be a historian, so I'm smarter. I think he was born.
Who did go to college to be a historian? I take issue with that.
Okay, well then you can correct me, but I do believe that he was not born in 1757. I think he was born in 1755. I think his hope was, and I'm about to go into this a little bit, of when he came to the United States, he was hoping to go to Princeton. And Princeton had this kind of like weird thing where they didn't want to accept people of too old in age, but they also wouldn't accept anyone too young. There was like this very fine line. And so he had applied for Princeton, and I believe that he had probably heard about what Aaron Burr did. Aaron Burr will have a bigger part to play in episode 3. But Aaron Burr was like the quickest graduating like student from Princeton. Got in, like he tried to get into Princeton when he was like 12. I think he ended up having to wait until he was like 14, but once he got in at 14, he got to skip a couple years and he got an accelerated graduation.
I mean, that makes sense though. If you can own a charter, you can go to college.
That's you know, I've been saying that for years, actually. So he did. Hamilton tried to go to Princeton. He was denied, and he ended up going to King's College, which would later become Columbia. Now, while he was at Columbia, he ended up getting into what I can only describe as like a Facebook fight with an English clergyman whose name was Samuel Seabury. Now, Samuel Seabury was a loyalist, obviously, to the British cause, and Hamilton had already done a decent amount of research on what was going on in the Americas. He didn't come into this blind. He's like, "What, you're telling me they're taxing us that much? The fuck?" No, he knew, and he was very clearly already on the side of let's start a revolution.
What year are we in now?
I believe this year it's probably 1774, 75.
Okay, gotcha.
I'm not entirely sure. I don't have it right in front of me.
Okay.
But so he ends up getting into this Facebook fight with Samuel Seabury because Samuel Seabury comes out with this pamphlet basically going like, "Hey, I think the British are right. I think we're fine." And Hamilton wrote back a pamphlet called A Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress. Now, this will be the first time that Hamilton starts to gain any notoriety in the States, although it didn't really pay off like that much for him in the long run necessarily for advancing his career. Historians are able to look back and go, yeah, that's clearly Hamilton that was writing this the entire time. Samuel Seabury responded with some other pamphlet that was also long and also long-winded. And then Hamilton responded to that with what was known as the Farmer Refuted, which was it gained renown in the colonies for being like a brilliant refutation of the loyalist idea. But it was also, I mean, it was a quick read at around 30,000 words.
Oh my, no.
No.
It's before computers. That would have taken too long to even count how many words that is.
Right.
After the fact.
Well, and so the Hamilton's writing style was actually quite interesting in a way, because what he would do is, instead of just writing, like, he wouldn't write things down and then make adjustments and like fix a page and that kind of thing. Well, the way he worked is, and I remember someone saying, it's like they were just watching Hamilton. He's pacing in his house and he's just like looking like he's not there. He's in his head. And then once he's run everything through his head, he just sat down and wrote it in one go. So I would imagine that what he did with this 30,000 page piece it's probably very similar. He went offline for a little while and then back into it.
Man, what a fantastic way of going about things. That just builds the reputation that he's like superhuman.
Oh yeah. And
his writing.
Yeah, and that's why people would listen to him talk, because it's riveting when he would go into these long speeches, or especially when he would be writing these pamphlets. But you know, like I said, at 30,000 words, this isn't like a like a Mormon pamphlet that you get at your door. You know, it's a fucking book. So he had that sent out. Now so this would have been 1775 to answer that question. I would imagine that was probably 1774, 1775. The King's College president of the college that he's going to, Miles Cooper, was a known loyalist. At one point, a mob of revolutionists, as I will call them just now, came to the college with the intention of tarring and feathering Miles Cooper, the president. So Miles Cooper is like up on a few floors up, and Hamilton sees all of this happening. They're clearly coming to tar and feather him. Is like, hey, I can't help but notice you guys have buckets of tar and feathers. Like, what's up with that? And they are calling for like him to come down. You know,
it does require a little bit of planning to do the tarring and feathering.
Yeah, you don't walk into one by accident. Yeah.
Go to Costco and get the tar and the feathers.
You got to heat it up. It's a whole fucking yeah. Exactly. So basically, Hamilton sees them, and he doesn't necessarily agree with Miles Cooper at all, but he's also not like big on tarring and feathering people. So he hops in front of them and he's like, "Hey guys, Miles Cooper, he's not here. I don't know who told you he was here, but he's not here." Now Miles Cooper hears Hamilton's voice, looks out the window, and sees Hamilton standing outside the thing talking to these people. He inaccurately assumes that Hamilton is enticing the crowd to tar and feather him. So he opens up the window and he goes, "Don't listen to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about."
Classic
Yeah.
loyalist.
He did end up escaping, and he made it back to. He quickly got on a boat back to England. But yeah, that's something that happened there. Later after that, Hamilton ends up joining the Revolution in a volunteer regiment, and he would spend his spare time basically educating himself on like military history and strategy. And he actually was doing really, really well. He ended up quickly moving through the ranks up to, I think it was artillery captain. Hamilton then, at one point, he participated in the Battle of Princeton on January 3rd, 1777.
At Princeton University.
Yeah. It'd be really weird if it was at King's College. They were like, we got to fix who's naming these battles, man. Why are we having the Battle of Italy in Burbank? But yeah, so sorry. Yeah, so that happened on January 3rd, 1777. Now there was an initial setback to that battle, but Washington was able to rally troops and lead them to a successful charge against the British forces. After making a brief stand, the British fell back, some leaving Princeton and others taking up refuge in Nassau Hall. Hamilton brought up 3 cannons and had them fire upon the building. And then some Americans rushed the front door, broke it down, and the British subsequently put out a white flag out the windows. And I think that the number that they had was 194 British soldiers walked out of the building, laid down their arms, and that ended the battle in an American victory. And that was one of the times that Hamilton was able to actually show that he had military prowess in some way.
Yeah, that's got to be props for Hamilton.
Right, but you'll notice throughout this story, Hamilton does not get many props for his military abilities because everyone's like, okay, yeah, you're great in like the wars, but you can write really good, you know? And Hamilton's like, I'm not big on the writing all the time. And I'll discuss a little bit more of that here in just a few. But yeah, that will be an ongoing thing for Hamilton of having that issue in the Revolution. Hamilton, after the Battle of Princeton, was invited to become an aide to William Alexander, Lord Stirling, and it's believed that he was asked for by another general to join his staff, or at least become an aide, by either Nathaniel Greene or Alexander McDougall. Now, just as what we were just talking about, he declined all of those invitations because he felt that he would serve better on the battlefield. Plus, it would allow him to rise through the ranks after the war, that he would have a better station. You know, now Washington eventually learned of Hamilton and invited him to be on his staff. And despite his previous refusals of, the other 3 generals, he decided to take Washington up on the offer. And I think, and this is where I'm not basing this off of a historian said this kind of thing, but I believe that the reason is because, Washington was already gaining a name for himself, and it was looking pretty obvious, like, hey, if we all win this, Washington's going to be president.
That is not shook out.
And a part of that reason was because not only was Washington, he was a really well-known general, but he was also from Virginia. And Virginia was slowly becoming kind of like, it was becoming a state that was going to need to be appeased in the formation of the United States. They weren't working a whole lot with the Federalist ideas. And it became very clear, well, if we can get Virginia on board by giving them like a president or giving us like, the person, this is going to be our leader, that could also help with getting legislation passed. So that's just kind of my belief. Washington and Hamilton's relationship blossomed, but not without its compromises. Now
True love never compromises.
yeah. Hamilton began to handle a considerable portion of Washington's correspondence. Now, mostly because, and I think that Washington recognized this, that no one understood Washington as well as Hamilton did. He was Hamilton would find it really easy to transcribe things that George Washington hadn't said but had thought into text. And do it in a way that matched like the tone that Washington wanted to come across. Hamilton didn't necessarily think that Washington was the best general. But
Yeah, right. Potomac, Washington, same guy.
But he also knew never, ever, ever say anything negative about Washington to anyone. Like, and that could also be self-serving, for the perspective of like, hey, this guy seems to be on my side and I'm helping him out. If he starts to go down in the rankings, it's not good for me either. But in general, Hamilton actually really understood Washington and believed in the things that Washington wanted to accomplish. But Hamilton, I I wish I in doing all my research, I couldn't find the exact words to describe how Hamilton handled being an aide de camp. But he would definitely exhibit what power he had to its fullest extent. There were a few times where he would basically just take established etiquette and throw it to the side. And he took charge of like any opportunity that would lend itself. He would belittle veteran field commanders and basically start assuming command that was above his station. And at one point, Hamilton started to feel bad because all the people that he was talking to they were basically like, hey, so you're not the general. So stop telling us what to do like you are the general. So Hamilton writes to Washington, he's like, hey, so am I like going above, like what am I doing? Am I wrong?
Yeah.
And Washington's like,
I'm wrong here, man.
yeah.
Am I the asshole?
Yeah. And Washington wrote back like essentially, if I'm not there and you're there, you're in charge. You know, in that regard. He's like, he's like, when I'm not there, you speak for me, so you're basically me when I'm gone.
Wow.
So
Wow. Well, I mean, yeah, that's a pretty like enormous assignment of power during wartime, where a general's like, yeah, man, if this guy says it,
yeah, and that would.
I've never heard this story of Hamilton's war history told quite the way that you're telling it, and he comes off pretty opportunistic.
Oh no, he is. Okay, yeah, I don't want that to be. Yes, I revere Hamilton a lot, as you can probably tell from every conversation we've had for like the last 6 months. But that's not to say that Hamilton was extremely opportunistic, but he had honor behind it. There would be a lot of times where he would definitely be called out for being opportunistic, and then people would think that because he was like that, that he would be doing it in other facets of life, which wasn't the case. His thing is he was kind of, this is more of a, Hamilton's thought was dress for the job you want, not the job you have. So a lot of it would be like, I think if I just keep doing this, I become a general. I don't think that was necessarily what it was, but it became like, hey, you're a shoo-in because you're already doing that.
Right.
If I may, yeah, I mean the army here, it's pretty scrappy, pretty new organization. So it's kind of like remember when we were like little kids and you'd start a club with your friends in the immediate, whoever you could reach out, like we're a gang now. Who's gonna be the gang leader? Who's gonna be the club leader? That seems to be the sort of, because it's so brand new. It's like a brand new country. The army's brand new.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I mean. Yeah, opportunistic, but what a better time to strike than when the iron is so hot.
Yeah.
And to that point,
yeah.
You said earlier that Hamilton didn't think that Washington was that great of a general, which was like heresy or whatever. But if you look into the historiography of the Revolutionary War, actually historians are coming around on that very opinion, that Washington was like pretty good, but he wasn't great.
Yeah.
And maybe he was the best we had, but that's not a foregone conclusion. So
quit trying to cancel George Washington.
Well, and 100%, that was basically Hamilton's view. Is like, this is the best we got, and I would do things massively differently. And Hamilton would have a lot of situations where it would come up where he would be insanely correct about things. I remember at one point there is a battle that he was in where he said, well, if the British general's smart, what he could do is if he comes right down this line right here, he'll just destroy us. Bright side is the guy's an idiot. I think he's going to go over here, so we're just going to leave that section open that would be the most ideal part to attack, and we'll defend the other spot that I think he'll go for because he's not smart enough to do the smart thing. And it turned out to be 100% correct.
That is ballsy, isn't it?
There was another portion. Oh, good.
Deep into military, just studying different military tactics and when he was in college. So it makes sense that he would be amazing at planning war.
Absolutely. And that's part of the reason that set him apart is like, yes, you have the fictional media that was very prevalent back in the day, famous plays, those kinds of things. But Hamilton was like actively doing all of the research. Like he was doing research on how to run a country before America really knew what the country was going to be. So then by the time, yeah, he's like, yeah, it's like, once we win, I want to be like, I want to be out, I want to hit the ground running. Whereas
that's what they call like in on the ground floor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So but later that same year, this is my favorite little part here. Later that same year, Hamilton met for the first time John Laurens. John Laurens was a vehement abolitionist who was hell-bent on creating the first all-black military battalion. Would often... Laurens was known to send letters to people going, there's no reason that black people are any different than white people in intelligence. That's a misconception by a lot of things, and I think that we have all of these slaves that could, help us win our freedom down here. And if we were to create an all-black battalion, maybe by them being part of it, that could also be a reason for their freedom. That was more of him being, he was compromising, because just going to like Virginia and going, hey, I was like, I just thought this crazy idea. What if you guys got rid of your slaves? They weren't big on that. So the idea of starting the all-black battalion as a way of not only getting military forces, but also accomplishing his main goal of abolitionism is what he was about. Laurens, when he met Hamilton, became very quickly Hamilton's best friend, and would be the best friend that Hamilton ever had. Now, Lauren had come to George Washington's staff as an aide de camp, just like Hamilton and Marquis de Lafayette, the Frenchman.
Camps does this guy need, man?
Yeah, tons of them. Now, there are historical scholars that believe that Lafayette and Hamilton were engaged in a scandalous homosexual affair. It is even more widely believed that Hamilton's and Laurens engaged in one as well. Now, much of this conclusion comes from letters between Hamilton and Laurens, as well as what was not in the letters. So I'm going to read a few things here, and then I'll explain a little bit of a backstory. The first letter that was sent between the two, this is the first letter that they ever had any correspondence on paper, was a letter from Hamilton to Laurens, and it opened thus. Cold in my professions, warm in my friendships, I wish, my dear Laurens, it might be in my power by action rather than words to convince you that I love you. I shall only tell you that till you bade us adieu, I hardly knew the value you had taught my heart to set upon you. Indeed, my friend, it was not well done. You know my opinion. You know the opinion I entertain of mankind, and how much it is my desire to preserve myself free of particular attachments, and to keep my happiness independent of the caprice of others. You should not have taken advantage of my sensibility to steal into my affections without my consent. But as you have done it, and as we are generally indulgent to those we love, I shall not scruple to pardon the fraud you have committed, on the condition that for my sake, if not for your own, you will continue to merit the partiality which you have so artfully instilled in me. Alexander Hamilton.
Dang.
Baby.
Now, the question...
That was hot.
I'm hard.
Yes. The question becomes, was that the vernacular at the time? Was that the standard way of talking to each other? I'm pretty certain me and Vinny have sent letters that are very similar, and we have only slept together once. So whether or not that indicates an affair.
And that was years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know. The indicating an affair part is interesting, and Scott, you and I have talked privately about the same letter situation. And I submit then, as I submit now, that it is directly, it's easy to directly say, like, oh yeah, they had an encounter.
Yeah.
That was like a physical encounter that left Hamilton feeling real good, I think.
Yeah, I think that would be very easy to say. Now, is that true? Well, I have some other letters as well as some anecdotal evidence. We do know that Lauren's father was questioned about Lauren's seemingly disinterest in women. Despite the fact that he had many suitors, he just didn't seem really interested in any of them for the most part. At least not early on. And his father responded, he's like, oh, yes, he's super interested in girls. He's just so busy with his studies, you know? He can't seem to find the time for them.
That's my boy.
Now, Hamilton, on the other hand, did have a fair share of affairs with ladies, and it is rumored, and anyone that's listening that is like a history buff will argue this point, but it's rumored that Martha Washington named her feral tomcat Hamilton because of the fact that he was so promiscuous. Yeah.
Getting it in.
But once again, that particular fact is highly debated on whether or not the cat was named after Hamilton or if the cat was even named Hamilton at all. However, it was in the biography. Hamilton also at one point requested that Lawrence find him a wife, which you would think that would lead the conversation away from homosexual conclusion. But that letter reads thus, and this is a subsection of this letter. He says to Lawrence, to excite their emulation, it will be necessary for you to give an account of the lover. His size, his make, quality of mind and body, achievements, expectations, fortune, etc. In drawing my picture, you will no doubt be civil to your friend, mind that you do justice to the length of my nose. Now, length of my nose is an old euphemism for the length of my penis. So at the very least, Hamilton's like, okay, either lie and say that I have a huge dick, or just tell them, you know how big my dick is, etc. Hamilton went on to say, after reviewing what I have written, I am ready to ask myself what could have put into my head to hazard this game of madness. Do I want a wife? No, I have plagues enough without desiring to add to that number. I've got a few letters between them here, so I apologize that I'm reading so many, but it will add fuel to the flame.
If I may, his voice is so pretty. His writing voice, right? I don't know. You
Right.
guys agree?
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah,
Yes,
for sure.
definitely.
Yes.
Read more Hamilton.
Yeah. Other letters between the two do indicate more to the notion of a relationship, however. In one letter, Hamilton chides Lawrence for not responding to his letters in a reasonable time. It reads, I acknowledge but one letter from you, since you left us on the 14th of July, which just arrived in time to appease a violent conflict between my friendship and my pride. I have written you 5 or 6 letters since you left Philadelphia, and I should have written you more had you made a proper return. But like a jealous lover, when I thought you had slighted my caresses, my affection was alarmed and my vanity piqued. I had almost resolved to lavish no more of them upon you, and to reject you as an inconstant and an ungrateful. But you have disarmed my resentment by a single mark of attention and made up the quarrel. Now, alas, Hamilton ended up being betrothed to Elizabeth Schuyler, the daughter of wealthy Philip Schuyler. Philip Schuyler would end up actually being part of the U.S. Senate later in life as well. Hamilton ended up writing to Lawrence about the engagement, and Hamilton had this to say. Have you not heard that I am on the point of becoming a Benedict? I confess my sins, I am guilty. Next fall completes my doom. I give up my liberty to Miss Schuyler. She is a good-hearted girl who I am sure will never play the termagant. Though not a genius, she has good sense enough to be agreeable. And though not a beauty, she has fine black eyes, is rather handsome, and has every other requisite of the exterior to make a lover happy. And believe me, I am a lover in earnest. Though I do not speak of the perfections of my mistress and the enthusiasm of chivalry.
What does that even mean? Is rather
I think it means
handsome
I'm fucking your
and-
daughter.
and has every other requisite of the exterior to make a lover happy. Is like
Yeah, now,
all of her parts are in the right place.
yeah, he's
driving a car.
he's like, all right, so she's not like that good looking. She's not a bombshell, bro. She's not a smoke show, but fine ass. Everything else looks good. We can make it work.
Question: This guy used to. So later on, he did banks and negotiations and
Oh,
all
yeah.
that stuff, right?
Oh yeah, dude.
So
hmm
I don't know. I mean, sounds kind of like he's negotiating this right now. Was he negotiating a dowry? Was that what he?
Well, no.
said?
So this was sent to Lawrence. He was sending this to Lawrence, who.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought. I'm sorry. I thought you said it was to like his.
Hey, man. So
to her daughter, to her father.
I've decided to marry your daughter. Now she's not that bright.
Yeah,
And
my
she's not
apologies.
that-
I thought that's where that was going.
I mean, she's not that cute, but damn, I mean, she's got a fine ass, and you know,
Her shoulders and breasts are where those things
Yeah.
go, and that is good.
She
And
has both of her
all the
eyes.
parts I need
yeah.
to make this thing work.
I-
That's so.
I can't tell you how happy I am to find out that she had arms. That's going to be helpful.
Isn't it kind of funny when we talk about like, okay, Hamilton culturally, he's against the grain because he's an abolitionist, and you know, he's really sympathizing for the freedom of a new nation. But that
Now my daughter's dumb as
misogyny.
shit.
that misogyny just stays right in there, huh?
Yeah, and so and yes, there was a decent amount of misogyny for him in his life. That, you know, obviously it doesn't look good. It's not great on paper. But moving on.
Which is where he put it. Sorry. No biggie, though.
Well,
It's
that
like a private letter, right? I mean,
yeah.
I'm not trying to defend
Yeah, that's
the
true, that's
misogyny,
true.
but like when judging historical actors, we do have to judge them within their context, and
Well
so it's within the context of his time and within the context of a private letter to like one of his buddies. So
Yeah.
yeah, not to excuse the behavior, but
Oh, that's true. Oh my God, what if anybody read our text messages, guys?
I'm gonna have to delete a lot of pictures from my phone here in a minute. So in that same letter, he does continue on. He says, that you can only speak of private affairs shall be no excuse for your not writing frequently. Remember that you write to your friends, and friends have the same interests, pains, pleasures, sympathies, and that all men love egotism. Now, in spite of Schuyler's black eyes, I still have a part for the public and another for you. So your impatience to have me married is misplaced. A strange cure, by the way, as if after matrimony, I was to be less devoted to you than I am now.
Oh.
Regardless, Lawrence did not attend the wedding, partly because he wanted Hamilton to himself, but mostly because he was in a British prison. I think that was the main part of it. Yeah, he got picked up as a prisoner of war, and then it was really weird. He actually got paroled, and he was in Pennsylvania, so he couldn't leave Pennsylvania. And Hamilton, like at one point, he's like, I mean, can't you leave Pennsylvania for like a minute? And he's like, no, I can't, essentially. But someone, and it's not necessarily confirmed whether or not this was a part of if this person showed up, but on the guest list for his wedding was none other than Aaron Burr, which he played some part in Hamilton's future in some way. I forget how.
Yeah, they were friends, right?
Yeah, they were like best friends. And it's funny because we were just talking about, you know, Hamilton putting this all down on paper. Burr actually had a very differing opinion, where he said, basically he doesn't like to write opinions down at all, because he's like, well, once it's there, it's like set in stone. You know, he's like, if I have an opinion, I'll say it in person without proof, essentially. And that's a bit of the dichotomy between the two. So I'm going to talk about, rather than continuing on the sexting via letter of Hamilton and Lawrence, because that's basically the most that we know. At one point, so Hamilton's now serving, or working with Washington. And there is a guy named Charles Lee, who felt as though Washington was a shit general. Not a fan. 4 out of 10 stars. And so, and I don't have all the information in front of me of exactly where he went to argue this point, but essentially, the powers that be agreed with him and was like, yeah, okay, so we're gonna put Charles Lee in charge for a little bit. And Charles Lee basically was in charge for the Battle of Monmouth, a very big battle that has a lot of implications. But at the Battle of Monmouth, Washington had to stay back for a bit because he's no longer leading the charges and that kind of thing. He's kind of staying back.
He got benched.
Yeah. But he's there. He's just not. He's not at the field. They're waiting for like some reinforcements to come in, and he's going to lead the reinforcements in to help out with the battle. But Washington's like, "Yo, Hamilton, go see how the battle's going." So Hamilton hops on a horse. He goes to run down there, and the battle's not going great. Actually, they're retreating away from the battle, and Hamilton's like, "Dude, what the fuck? We shouldn't be retreating right now. There's no reason we should be retreating." And he's like, turn back around. And basically Washington gets word of this, and he's like yelling, like he's like screaming on the battlefield, like obscenities, which is out of Washington's character of like, get back. We're not, he's like, we have reinforcements coming. We're going to go back. And so Washington and Hamilton just on horseback, just lead, like just start grabbing people that are retreating as Charles Lee is still running. Like, we're going back. We're going to fucking fight this thing. And they didn't end up winning the battle, but it did result in a few things. I believe, and you know, the fact checkers and on the YouTube and all that will tell me that I'm wrong. Yeah, in this battle, Hamilton's, I think, horse got shut out from underneath him, as well as Aaron Burr's. Aaron Burr's horse got shot out from underneath him, and he landed so hard he was unable to partake in any further battles in the Revolution. So
that sucks.
Yeah, but luckily they ended up at turning the battle into a stalemate, so they didn't lose ground. Now during all of this time, when Charles Lee got back, they took him to court, and you know, they wanted him like fired and all that stuff. I think the court ended up giving him a they suspended him from service for a year. So Charles Lee then turns around and basically just starts talking shit about Washington everywhere he can, writing shit. Anyone that'll listen, you know, he's just like, you know, Washington's a piece of shit, fuck Washington, etc. And
what a jerk.
Right. You know, and Washington's back in charge now. So what ends up happening is Charles Lee says something else, and John Laurens, the best friend of Hamilton, is like, I can't let him sit and talk shit about Washington. So he challenges Charles Lee to a duel, and they have one. They ended up having a duel. Charles, I think Laurens shot Charles Lee in the side, and then Charles Lee wanted to continue, but everyone's like, bro, you just been shot. No. Like, it's
amazing.
Yeah, you don't want to do that. And the way that they walked off, before they walked off the battlefield, they were like, Laurens was basically like, I don't want to continue this. You know, I think I've made my point. But if you're going to stand up, I'll do it. Like, I'll go round two, bro. And Charles Lee basically said, what you've heard that I've said about Washington, I never said. And I think Washington's a fine commander. And Laurens was like, all right, I'm cool. Laurens is number 2, aka the negotiator for the duel, and you know, his backup was in fact Hamilton. Hamilton was at that duel.
Wow.
So they get back, and there's a bit of time later where, and Hamilton had been asking Washington to be in charge of a regiment for since he knew Washington, because once again this goes back to the fact that Hamilton wanted to rise above his station after the war, and Hamilton told him, or Washington was like, no. So this continued to be a fight where he would ask him like every 10 minutes, hey man, what about you? What do you think about putting me in charge of a regiment? And Washington's like, no. And the whole reason that Washington said no is like, you know, his point of view is like, I have tons of brilliant military commanders that are under me. but I only have one Hamilton that, you know, can write and understand me and do the correspondence that I need. So Hamilton's pissed off about this, and what ends up happening is at one point Washington shows up to Hamilton's house after they've had a little bit of a tiff, and Hamilton's like walking down the stairs. He sees Washington, and Washington's like, "Hey, I need to talk to you." And Hamilton's like, "Oh yeah, give me like 1 second." And so then he walks over and talks to Lafayette, who, by the way, was randomly in his house. Not suggesting anything. Just was just there.
Earlier you did.
Just throwing that one out there. And then he walked over to one of the servants, was like talking to them, and he came back to Washington. And Washington was like, "Okay, that was massively disrespectful. You know, you made me wait for 10 minutes. And he's like, "Oh, did you think that was disrespectful? Well, seems like we shouldn't talk right now because you're in a bad mood." And then he like walked back up the stairs. So Washington stormed out. He was pissed because no one's ever done that to him. And so, especially not someone that's like supposed to be on his side. So Washington goes back, and then he sends a servant, or, you know, like, I won't say servant, but it was a person that was under him, sent him to Hamilton, was like, "Hey, so Washington's sorry. He would really like for you to come over to his place and like talk for a minute."
Like babies.
And Hamilton was like, "I really appreciate that you are, you know, that he's apologizing. And I also appreciate that I've been given the option to say no. I'm not going over there. Goodbye." And sent him off. And then and so then Hamilton's writing in letters to people, like I don't remember exactly to who, but he was writing to letters that were found. And in one of them, he's talking about like the absurdity of Washington. He's like saying, "I had him there for 10 minutes, just leaving him there for 10 minutes. He was like, it was like 30 seconds. He's talking mad shit. And then in a few days after that, Hamilton comes to the sudden realization that Washington wanted to be close with Hamilton. Like, he wanted to be friends with Hamilton. And Hamilton's like, saying this in the letter, he's like, "No offense to Washington, but I don't want to be his friend. We are as close as we need to be." Which it says a lot, because despite how close they actually were and all the things that, you know, that he would do, he wrote all of his correspondence. When Washington eventually retired, he wrote that correspondence for Washington, the going away letter, essentially. And by all accounts, you would think that they would be friends, but Hamilton just had no interest in being friends with them. He wasn't friends with everybody, despite the fact that he had a very high charisma stat. So yeah, so that was basically what Hamilton's and Washington's relationship was. And what ended up happening is a little while later, Hamilton goes to Washington and he's like, "All right, so if you don't give me command of a regiment, I'm gonna quit."
Yeah, right.
And essentially Washington relents. And Hamilton was getting good recommendations from like Lafayette, for no particular reason, that he would be, you know, a great commander, you know. And so, like I said, Washington finally relented. They had Hamilton was able to partake in the Battle of Yorktown as a commander. They won the Battle of Yorktown, and thus ended the United States Revolutionary War.
Bam. Because Hamilton was the best commander.
Oh, he was, yeah. There's no one better.
That's the way Scott kind of made it sound like.
No, he was good. He was good. He was definitely super smart. And I remember at one point that one of the things I didn't get to cover was Hamilton died in a ship fight. That he had to jump off the side of the ship and swim to shore, and then it was reported that he was killed, which was surprising to the people when he walked in a few hours later. It was like, "What's everyone crying for?" You know,
pulls his shoe out. It's like water pours out of the shoe. What did I miss?
Yeah, what did I miss?
Well, I think that's the coolest thing. So Alexander Hamilton, warrior poet, is kind of like what I'm picking up here.
Yeah. Yeah, think Viking bard. You know, that's his writing style was unmatched from, for his entire life. And it was, it is so surprising to me that I would relate to Hamilton so much, as one person stated, that Aaron Burr could say in 30 minutes what it took Hamilton 2 hours to say. I have no understanding as to why I might relate with Hamilton a bit.
Yeah, Scott.
I have an idea.
But you got.
So, one last thing I want to cover, and I don't know where this fits in the timeline, but I remember it, was the Benedict Arnold story. Because Hamilton always had this insane way of accidentally being at like major historical events. So he's at him in Washington. I believe Washington's there. Either way, Hamilton is there with Benedict. And Benedict gets news that they have found a spy that was selling, or giving information to the British government. And Benedict immediately and unsurprisingly gets really flustered by this and has a little bit of a change of like, oh Jesus, okay, yeah, no, it's great. Get him.
What are you guys talking about?
Which one was it? Kevin? Steve? Which one was it? It's Kevin. Okay.
It was me, was it?
Yeah.
Let's
So
go fuck Steve up just in case.
yeah, it became very clear that Benedict knew about this guy. They had correspondence. If they had him, they were probably, if they had this guy, then they were going to have Benedict. So. And Hamilton is with Benedict at the time, like at the same place. They are eating at the same table when all this is happening. And so Benedict's like, well, I'm going to go upstairs for a little bit. You guys have fun. And Hamilton's like, yeah, that's cool. So I'm going to stay down here. He was with Lafayette for no reason. And so I just love saying this. I do not think that him and Lafayette had a relationship, by the way, but regardless.
It's all I can think
They were
about.
trusted friends.
Yes.
Does anybody else imagine Ryan Reynolds as playing the part of Marquis de Lafayette? Sorry, Scott.
I can see it.
Now I do.
I can see it. And so Benedict is like, yeah, I'm gonna go upstairs for a minute. And then essentially he just disappears from the house, and his wife starts going nuts, man. His wife is going crazy, like saying like, you guys are out to kill my husband, and starts putting on this, like just saying the weirdest, most obscure things when everyone's like, oh yeah, Benedict's not here. He must have gone somewhere. So about an hour or two later, while Benedict's wife is still once again just going like insane, like, like this is all like, she was just saying things that sounded like someone was going into like a mental breakdown. And so then
making it weird.
Yeah. It's like no one was really all that worried about Benedict until she started being really weird. And so Washington shows up and he's like, hey, where's Benedict? And he's like, I don't know. He was here and then now he's not. Like, I don't know where he went. And so Washington's like, oh, well, and it says in the biography that he had tears in his eyes. Was like, Benedict betrayed us. And he's like crying about it. And so now the wife is like, they're trying to talk to the wife, and the wife is not having it. She's like, this is all a fucking setup. You guys are fucking lying. He wouldn't do that, all this stuff. What am I going to do? And then she starts like freaking out. Did he leave? Did he think you guys were going to kill him? You guys going to kill him? And all that stuff. And he's going just nuts. She's just going nuts. And Hamilton sees all this, and she's like, he has this thing for damsels in distress. And is like, hey, it's all going to be fine. Don't worry. We all recognize that you're not a part of this, but we're going to try to catch, your husband who was a part of it. And she's like, I didn't know anything about anything. And so they leave her alone. They try to get Benedict. They don't get him. Although Hamilton later tried to trade another spy for Benedict so that they could get him. They could. What's that, Vinny?
She was totally in on it, though.
Yeah,
she was totally a spy.
Well, I will tell you, Hamilton is infallible, and Hamilton said no, she's not.
Well, right. So he thinks not, though. That's amazing.
Yeah.
She was absolutely a spy, right?
Right. So, well, hypothetically, but what we do know is that she left there and went to her friend Theodosia's. and was like, hey, so they caught Benedict, and Hamilton and Washington were both at my house, and they fucking fell for it, bro. Like, they had no idea that I wasn't a part of it. Like, they had, like, oh, we got away with it, those dumb idiots, etc. And I don't know what Theodosia said, but I do know what she did, which was not long after she married, or at least was in a relationship with, none other than Aaron Burr.
Yeah.
Yes.
That double crossing.
What?
Yeah, she was actually married to a British officer. So Aaron Burr was sleeping with her while she was married to a British officer. And then I don't know exactly what happened to the British officer, but I know that he ended up marrying her.
I gotta say, this has been super interesting because, like, I majored in American history, so, like, I know most of the major events here. But, like, what you've just given us is, like, the Gossip Girl version of the Revolutionary War.
Well,
Right.
and that's the
There's
thing.
so much stuff that I didn't know.
Yeah, that is essentially what Hamilton was, and I'm going to go more into that when we get to the Reynolds pamphlet, because the Reynolds pamphlet is the closest thing to a, hey guys, it's, you know, this is my Facebook post basically telling you all the things that you should never put to the public. It is a full-on, like, diatribe kind of thing, and Hamilton was known for that, of saying things that would be like, most people would be like, that's not, you should keep that to yourself, and he would do it anyway. You know, that's one of the bright sides that this happened when you had to write letters, so he had to really think out what he was going to write, because, you know, one wrong pen stroke. But
I like this guy.
So when Hamilton died, his wife was adamant about making a biography about him, because everyone had turned on him after he died and started saying things that weren't true about him. And she viewed him like he was an angel. And so she was adamant about getting a biography, and she had her son, like, work on it. She had a few different biographers try to work on it. And her son, I think, actually finally published it 7 years after after her death. But one of the things that happened is those letters that I wrote from you, from Laurens, you know, to Laurens and from Laurens, there was a few different letters that had a lot of things crossed out, and had a note added that we believe is by one of his sons, that said, I must not publish the whole of this. So that is what we were able to read. There are things that were also said we were not able to read.
That's so cool. Well, yeah, also, Matt alluded to this earlier, and I'll state it boldly. No one belongs in Hamilton's dirty laundry. Like, that's not okay. Private letters are supposed to be private. It's not like he did anything bad. He was just loving, man. He was just loving humankind. Yeah.
Yeah, no, by no means am I saying anything negative about that. But however, at the time, that behavior was punishable by death. Not even like a misdemeanor. So the concept of talking about it in this particular podcast is more so a, you know, the uncandid nature that Hamilton had to, like, discuss in these letters that, if history serves, he's had a letter be published in a newspaper in his life that was not, you know, intended to be read by the newspaper, but was intended to be read by the recipient in which he wrote it to. So the idea that Hamilton would take these types of risks in writing, you know, things that could never be published, I felt was a legitimate reason to talk about it.
History is pretty whack, but when you can be published at 14 for writing about the sort of looseness of a young lady's moral virtue, and then at the same time it's the same subject matter, but it's man on man, and it's like, this must never be spoken. It's like Voldemort,
Right.
when it's two gentlemen. I've always found that funny, and I think we'll find that throughout these, like, history stories.
Yeah.
Weird double standard.
Yeah. Well, but regardless of all these things that I've said so far, they won the war. And now they have to start a nation from scratch. And that is where we're going to leave tonight's episode. If you want to follow us on Twitter, you can follow us for me, you can follow me at that one loud guy. You can follow Matt at matchroll20. You can follow Molly at Malswald. MOLSWALD. And you can follow Vinny at The Weekend. THEWEEKND. The Weekend. That's been our episode. Tune in next week when Matt takes the hot seat. We all love you. Molly, would you want to do us the honors?
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Woo! Good job. See you guys. Bye.
Bye.
Hamilton.
We're talking to a maker of gnomes.
I find the sexiest part of the gnome is the size of the gnome.
Tell us when you first had the idea to create these delightful little scamps.
Well, first off, thanks for having me on today. And I guess I first started making gnomes like most kids. I would close my eyes, and in the bathtub, I would have certain, sort of imaginary play dates with these creatures. They would tell me things like disobey my parents and a lot of violent fantasies. And I started to draw, and that was after we cleaned up some of the original drawings and the therapy was over, I had a pretty good product. We started baking them into a kiln. We started